The ARA San Juan S-42 submarine was on its way from Ushuaia to Mar del Plata when it suddenly disappeared. The last contact with ground control was on November 15, 2017, and a massive search and rescue operation followed for weeks. Still, there was no sign of the wreckage, and many theories circulated about its whereabouts, with many people speculating that the submarine was on a mission to spy on British vessels near the Falklands. But the truth would not be known until precisely a year and a day later. ARA San Juan S-42 was laid down on March 19, 1982, and launched on June 30, 1983. The submarine joined the Argentine Navy in 1985 and served with the submarine force from 1987 until 2017, when it mysteriously disappeared. The TR-1700 class diesel-electric submarine was built in West Germany by Thyssen-Nordseewerke. It had a single-hull, lightweight bow and stern, and a watertight structure in the center. Its name came from the province of San Juan, with the prefix ARA in place of Armada de la República Argentina, or the Argentine Navy. In 1994, ARA San Juan participated in war games and exercises with the U.S. Navy. During the Fleet X-294 George Washington practice, the submarine avoided being detected by American anti-submarine forces. It also participated in practices such as the Gringo Gaucho aircraft carrier maneuvers, UNITAS Sea exercises, and in-port training. Between 2008 and 2013, the vessel underwent substantial repairs at the Argentine Industrial Naval Complex, which took over 500,000 combined work hours. The ship was cut in half during the restoration and had its 4 MTU engines and batteries replaced. However, the vessel was not upgraded in any way, keeping the same outdated technology from the 1980s. Defense Minister Oscar Aguad even maintained that despite the 625 total repairs, the S-42 was not left in perfect condition. Afterward, ARA San Juan would then be entrusted with surveying the exclusive area around Puerto Madryn, focusing on fighting illegal fishing. In late 2017, the submarine approached the Falkland Islands area, and on November 4th, Second Non-Commissioned Officer Roberto Daniel Medina sent a message to his sister Jessica, saying, quote, "On Monday, there was a British helicopter after us, and yesterday the Chilean. There's a lot of movement over here." ARA San Juan would disappear 11 days later. On November 15, 2017, ARA San Juan disappeared without a trace. The official announcement came 2 days later, after a search and rescue operation had already been launched 230 miles to the southeast of San Jorge Gulf. The submarine was carrying a crew of 44, including the first female submarine officer, Ilona Kravchik, in her first year aboard the S-42. The people on board only had 7 days of oxygen supply, and the rescue mission was rushed. The Argentine Armed Forces also set up a center of operations at the naval base in Mar del Plata that welcomed the sailors' families. It included a team of mental health professionals. The International Charter, Space and Major Disasters was activated on November 17th, providing humanitarian satellite coverage. The following day, several transmission signals believed to be from the submarine were reported from a satellite phone, but they were later dismissed. Severe weather conditions during the next few days hampered the search effort, and on November 20th, the Argentine Navy announced that the critical phase was approaching. They also discarded a potential communications issue, as the submarine would have already come back to port. Several sonars from Argentinian ships and U.S.-dropped buoys detected noises that sounded similar to banging on a hull, but further analysis proved that they were probably of biological origin. By November 21st, the search area had expanded to almost 500,000 square kilometers, and 15 aircraft and 17 ships were participating in the mission. The next day, the Argentine Navy investigated a so-called hydroacoustic anomaly picked up 3 hours after the last contact. Consequently, the air and sea rescue patrols were sent back to the exact point of the last communication. On the 23rd, the Argentine ambassador in Vienna informed the Navy that an event consistent with an explosion was detected by CTBTO seismic anomaly listening posts on the Ascension and Crozet Islands. The lead wasn't ruled out, as the submarine hadn't been located yet. And by November 24th, more than 30 aircraft and ships, as well as 4,000 personnel from 13 countries, joined the search. 3 days later, Argentine Navy spokesman Captain Enrique Balbi disclosed to the press that the last report from the submarine stated that the snorkel had leaked water into the forward storage batteries on the 14th, which ignited a fire. The crew managed to douse the flames, but they had to disconnect the forward batteries and continue only with the aft ones. Finally, 2 weeks after ARA San Juan went missing, the Navy canceled the rescue efforts. The mission now turned to recover the wreckage. The search and rescue operation was the largest in the history of the South Atlantic Ocean. But by February of 2018, the international help ceased, and the Argentine government had to carry on despite the discouraging results. As a last desperate effort, they offered a reward of about $5 million for any information on the submarine's whereabouts. 7 months later, the Argentine government hired the Ocean Infinity Company for 60 days on a results-based payment plan. And on November 16, 2018, they finally reported a new point of interest. The submarine's wreckage was eventually located at a depth of 907 meters, 20 kilometers from the seismic anomaly reported by the CTBTO. The submarine lay shattered in several pieces on the sea floor, and images taken that day show the imploded pressure hull. Tragedies of this scale usually happen due to a series of escalating mistakes rather than a single cause. The wreck's vestiges completely discarded the possibility of an external attack, giving way to theories about internal failures. One of them pointed to water entering through a ventilation pipe when a valve fizzled, which then filtered through the ducts and reached the batteries. However, it's unclear if the failure was due to a human error. It was concluded that as the water reached the battery tank number, it produced a deflagration by the acclimation of hydrogen, leading to combustion without an explosion. The entire crew would have perished instantly, and the submarine would have wandered uncontrollably at the mercy of the sea currents. Marcelo Schroer, the Navy's chief of the general staff at the time, was dismissed and later issued a press release in which he said that, quote, "It is a sum of mistakes they made, I have no doubt." He also added that his subordinates concealed information from him, arguing that he expected more professional behavior. Meanwhile, Defense Minister Oscar Aguad pointed out that the submarine was not in good condition and remarked on both technical and human errors. He expressed that, quote, "I have the impression it was not given enough entity to the fire in the battery bars," while recalling a similar incident from 1995. According to naval specialists, the submarine's repairs had been insufficient and pointed out that other factors also contributed, such as harsh weather conditions, the personnel's inadequate training, and a lack of proper protocol to manage dangerous situations. Argentine Navy spokesman Captain Balbi later commented on Roberto Daniel Medina's message to his sister about spotting British helicopters in the area. Balbi claimed that the region in question shares waters with Chile, with the Beagle Canal belonging to Argentina in the north and Chile in the south. He then added that the zone was constantly plagued with Chilean helicopters, so it could all have been a confusion. Furthermore, he clarified, quote, "There's nothing political behind the subject." IJN Myoko was a genuinely imposing heavy cruiser, but she'd been crippled during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and sent to Japan for repairs. Even so, she was so damaged that she could not make the return trip alone. It was December of 1944, and with her escort, the destroyer Ushio, she steamed for the home islands. But as they sailed across the Pacific on the evening of the 13th, they were suddenly attacked by an undetected enemy roaming the dark waters. Myoko stopped to assess the situation. She could barely sail, and the hidden enemy could strike any moment. Incapable of engaging in an open pursuit, the ships attempted to flee and continue their challenging trip to Japan. The enemy, however, would not let them get away so quickly. As the lead ship of her class of heavy cruisers within the Imperial Japanese Navy, Myoko was the first of her sisters to be laid down, though she was the third to be completed. She was also the first of the 10,000-ton cruisers built by any nation, and received her name from Mount Myoko in Niigata. The heavy cruiser was built within the design constraints imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty during the 1922 to 1929 Fleet Modernization Program. Even so, the ship received several modifications and rebuildings throughout the 1930s, increasing her final displacement to roughly 16,000 tons. The Myoko class was actually an enlarged version of the Ioba-class cruiser, and the lead ship was over 200 meters long, with a beam of roughly 20 meters and a draft of 6.36 meters. She could reach a speed of 35.5 knots, propelled by 12 compound boilers that drove 4 sets of single-impulse geared turbine engines, while 4 shafts turned 3-bladed propellers. The heavy cruiser's armor consisted of a 102mm thick side belt and a deck of 35mm. However, her bridge was unarmored. As for armament, Myoko had a main battery of 10 20cm or 40 Type 89 naval guns mounted in 5 main turrets. Remarkably, she had the heaviest armament of any heavy cruiser in the world. In addition, the warship had a secondary armament of 8 12.7cm or 40 Type 89 naval guns in 4 twin mounts on each side, and carried 12 Type 93 long lance torpedoes and 4 triple launchers below the aircraft deck. The massive cruiser had a capacity for 3 float planes and an aircraft catapult for scouting missions. Myoko was launched in 1927 and commissioned 2 years later. Myoko first saw action during the Second Sino-Japanese War, serving as the flagship of Sentai 9. Afterward, she received a retrofit that would extend her service life into the 1940s. By the time World War II broke out, she and her sisters were rather old, but still capable of joining the fight. The ship had her number of torpedoes doubled to 16, and was also fitted with 8 25mm anti-aircraft guns, which would prove useful in the Pacific clashes. In the early stages of the war, Myoko participated in the invasion of the Philippines and the Battle of the Java Sea. Then, in March of 1942, the cruiser and her sister, Ashigara, sank the British heavy cruiser Exeter, with help from destroyers Akabono and Inazuma. Later on, she became the flagship of the carrier strike force during Operation Mo, the attempted invasion of Port Moresby, leading the aircraft carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. She also took part in the Tulagi invasion and the subsequent Battle of the Coral Sea, resulting in a Japanese retreat and abandoning the operation in Papua New Guinea. During the epic Battle of Midway, the heavy cruiser was part of the support force and was thus deployed as an escort for the reinforcement convoy in the Aleutian Islands campaign. Then, in October 1942, she continued her reinforcement and resupply missions on Guadalcanal and the bombardment at Henderson Field when it was seized by the Americans. Myoko also helped evacuate Guadalcanal and Kiska before being sent to Sasebo for another refit. While there, she was equipped with newer Type 96 25mm ATAA gun mounts and a Type 21 radar set. In the summer of 1944, Myoko fought in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, responding to the American invasion of the Mariana Islands. And later that year, she crossed paths with the U.S. Task Force 38 and was damaged by a torpedo hit during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Consequently, Myoko had to limp back to Singapore and depart for Japan. Little did she know that an encounter with USS Burgal would determine her fate. On December 5, 1944, USS Burgal departed Australia, bound for patrol work on the Malayan and Indochina coast. The submarine was loaded with anchored mines in her aft torpedo tubes, as her mission was to lay them off along a long reef known as the Royalist Bank. That same afternoon, Myoko sailed to the Japanese mainland, where she could be repaired. Accompanied by destroyer Ushio, the pair would depart sometime around December 9th. However, their departure was postponed, and Burgal was just emerging from the Lombok Strait the morning they were ready. Shortly past dawn on the 12th, the cruiser and her companion finally got underway. Making matters worse, Ushio was also damaged, so neither ship could sail much faster than about 17 knots. In the middle of the chaotic scene at the Pacific Theater in late 1944, both ships advanced slowly but surely across areas of great activity, with a slight chance that the partly operational cruiser might be suddenly called for duty. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, the stealthy U.S. submarine was just arriving to lay her cargo off at Royalist Bank. As the sun set on the 13th, Burgal was preparing to complete her mission when an unexpected radio signal came in. It meant that a powerful transmitter had to be around. Commander J.M. Hyde then looked through the periscope, and there she was, a Japanese warship at 35,000 yards heading northeast at 14 knots. The skipper swung the boat around, all 4 engines on maximum speed, and hurried to get ahead of the enemy's track. Burgal was gaining the advantage, but the engine's vibrations forced the crew to slow down. At 7:20 p.m., they finally secured a firm contact as Burgal made the position. An hour later, the target was clearly in sight, but recognizing the impending danger of assaulting a mighty heavy cruiser and her escort, Hyde and his officers held their breath. A submerged approach was impossible. The waters were too shallow. And to complicate matters, Burgal's aft tubes were filled with mines, rendering them unusable. An attack could only be launched from the bow tubes. Undaunted, Hyde had his vessel run under the cover of darkening skies, hoping that the enemy's radar did not pick his own too soon. The crew then noticed a window of opportunity just as the heavy cruiser and her escort overlapped. Bergall immediately fired all bow tubes at 3,300 yards, and within seconds, the first and second torpedoes hit home, detonating into a thundering explosion. Myoko stopped in her tracks, while her escort also stopped abeam. This led to the submarine's crew believing she had also been struck. Myoko's damage was severe, with fires around the cruiser's aft turrets. However, her main body, forward of the mainmast, remained untouched, and the ship was not nearly shattered. Even so, Hyde believed the impact had been more significant. He then turned to reload for the final blow, while Ushio began setting a trap for the attacking submarine. Believing them inoperable, Bergall came in for the coup de grace, but Ushio immediately opened fire. The precise salvo tore through the forward torpedo loading trunk's hatch, piercing the submarine. Water quickly started pouring into the pressure hull. Hyde maneuvered and evaded a second pair of shells, just as Ushio snapped on a searchlight, but the submarine avoided detection. Unable to dive, Hyde fled the scene, putting as much distance between his crew and the enemy as possible. Luckily for the Americans, Ushio did not go after them. In the end, Myoko was severely harmed, but not as much as the skipper pondered. Still able to make 6 knots, the cruiser's captain resolved to save her. Ushio would keep Myoko on track with a tow line, given that she could no longer steer, and both began an arduous crawl to Singapore. The situation was no better on board Bergall, where the crew stuffed mattresses into the hole to keep the spray out and struggled with electrical fires for a couple of days. Now that any aerial attack would have to be evaded on the surface, vigilance was redoubled, and all available guns were manned. The nearest base, Exmouth Gulf, was 2,000 miles away. In a clever decision, the skipper opted to sail closer to the coast, so that patrolling aircraft would confuse the submarine with an ordinary boat. Then, on the 15th, Bergall met with USS Angler and transferred 54 men and an officer to safety, hanging on to a skeleton crew that would attempt to take the submarine across the Karimata Strait. Hyde ordered Angler's skipper not to rescue them should they be attacked. Instead, he stated, quote, "Save your boat and the rest of my men." Meanwhile, fires raged on board Myoko. It wasn't until the 15th, too, that the Japanese found friendly ships, but the weather was severe. Even so, the small convoy managed to escort the cruiser to Singapore for repairs. By February of 1945, it was evident that Myoko was irreparable and that it was impossible to tow her to Japan. Instead, the heavy cruiser remained in Singapore, acting as an anti-aircraft battery, while her nemesis continued her service well into the 1950s. During the early days of World War II, the Kriegsmarine sent their U-47 Type 7B submarine on a one-way mission that was believed to be impossible to achieve. Led by Captain Günther Prine, the secret operation consisted of infiltrating the Royal Navy's most important naval base. Scapa Flow was located in the Orkney Islands in Scotland, and the objective was to do as much damage as possible to the British fleet stationed there. It was a crazy mission, and even the toughest of sailors doubted that it could be done. Nevertheless, one cold morning in October of 1939, Captain Prine and his crew set course for Scapa Flow to prove that the Royal Navy was not invincible, and that they weren't afraid of it. After the Third Reich annexation of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Sudetenland, tensions escalated between the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Germany. Despite the Munich Agreement of 1938, the British and the French knew all too well that Hitler's thirst to recover the territories that once belonged to the Second German Empire was not over yet. Their suspicions then came true after the Führer offered Poland a peaceful negotiation for the recovery of Danzig and the Polish corridor. As the Polish government refused, Hitler felt insulted and decided that going to war was the only way to move forward. After negotiating the occupation of Poland with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, Hitler firmly believed that neither France nor Great Britain would declare war against Germany. But he was proven wrong when both Allied forces turned against him. Despite the disruption that ultimately became known as the Phony War, the Kriegsmarine had taken the necessary precautions. Weeks before the September 1939 attack against Poland, the German Navy had dispatched some of its submarines in a preemptive move that would enable them to attack enemy ships as soon as the war broke out, which is exactly what happened. U-47, assigned to the 7th U-boat flotilla, was one of such submarines. Led by Captain Günther Prien, she was off to a remarkable career. The Type 7B U-boat was laid down in February of 1937 at Friedrich Krupp Germaniawerft in Kiel and commissioned in December of 1938. Type 7 was the most common class produced by the Kriegsmarine during the war, and over 700 such submarines were built. The Type 7B was an improved version of the smaller and lighter Type 7A variant, with the torpedo aft tube moved to the inside of the boat. In addition, an extra torpedo could be housed below the deck plating of the electric motor room, and 2 others could be stored in watertight compartments under the upper deck. Overall, it had a capacity of 14 torpedoes. Secondary armament included one 8.8cm SK C-35 naval gun with 200 rounds and one 2cm C-30 anti-aircraft gun. The submarine could also carry up to 20 naval mines instead of torpedoes. Furthermore, the Type 7B carried 33 tons of additional fuel in external tanks, which bolstered the U-boat's range to about 4,600 kilometers at a speed of 19 kilometers per hour while surfaced. The engines featured 2 rudders for better agility, and the submarine was powered by 2 F-46 4-stroke 6-cylinder supercharged diesel engines. When fully submerged, she was powered by 2 AEG GU-460-8276 double-acting electric motors. Furthermore, the submarine could operate at depths of up to 230 meters and be manned by 4 officers and between 40 and 56 sailors. By the time Günther Prien was appointed the U-47's captain, he was already a seasoned and well-respected sailor. Then, on August 19, 1939, he departed from Kiel on his first war patrol with the submarine. Prien and his men circumnavigated the British Isles to gather intelligence about the mobilization of the Royal Navy fleet during the weeks leading up to the Poland invasion. Then, on September 3, 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that the country was officially at war with Germany, with France soon following. 2 days later, U-47 entered the Gulf of Biscay and eventually sank SS Bosnia, Rio Carlo, and Gardavan. During the following days, the German crew sighted several British warships, but were unable to engage them. Captain Prien and his men then made way to German waters to resupply and get a good rest before their second patrol. Soon, Prien and Lieutenant Wellner, the captain of U-14, were summoned by Admiral Karl Dönitz himself. Both men looked at each other in astonishment, fearing something terrible had happened. Then, after waiting for hours in the war room while other sailors deliberated with the Admiral, Prien's turn finally came. The Admiral greeted Prien with a friendly tone, and after a brief conversation, he was introduced to a chart spread out on a table. 2 words in the chart caught his attention: Scapa Flow. It was then that Prien realized that the Admiral was planning an operation against the Royal Navy's most important base. Dönitz caught Prien's surprised expression, turned to him, and calmly said, quote, "Tell me, Prien, do you think that a determined commander could get his U-boat inside Scapa Flow and attack the enemy naval forces lying there?" The captain had difficulty putting together his thoughts, and then Dönitz added, quote, "I do not want you to give me an answer now. Think it over, report back on Tuesday, and let me have your considered opinion then. Whichever way you decide, it will not be a black mark against you. It will not affect the high opinion we have of you." After the meeting, Prien secluded himself and devised an effective plan to break into Scapa Flow and make it out alive. He memorized the Scapa Flow charts, and after hours of studying, he was determined to carry on with the mission. The captain then reported to Dönitz the following day, who simply asked, quote, "Yes or no?" Prien then responded affirmatively. Dönitz smiled and reminded him that other men had attempted the same mission during World War I and had not made it back. He then stood up, shook Prien's hand, and wished him luck. The die was cast. On October 8, 1939, U-47 began her second patrol and headed off to the North Sea. The mission had to be kept secret, and the U-47's crew was not told about the primary objective. Still, the men knew that something was cooking up. Located at the center of the Orkney Islands on the northern coast of Scotland, Scapa Flow was the ideal anchorage, as the natural harbor was large enough to house the entire Royal Navy fleet. Scapa Flow was surrounded by small islands separated by narrow and shallow channels with fast racing tides, which would be natural obstacles to Prien's U-boat. Still, there were more elaborate hurdles that they would have to overcome, such as block ships and floating booms that the British had installed after World War I. A few days before reaching Scapa Flow, Prine told the crew about the fundamental nature of their mission. Many sailors believed it was a one-way journey, and tension took hold of the submarine. However, everyone continued doing their jobs, and the submarine finally reached her destination on October 14th. U-47 was able to avoid several British warships that patrolled the area, the treacherous currents, and every other obstacle in her path, and at 2:27 a.m., Prine told the crew, quote, "We are in Scapa Flow." The crew cheered, and to Prine's surprise, the anchorage was almost empty, with no ships in sight. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the Royal Navy had dispersed its fleet. While looking for a suitable target and remaining undetected, U-47 came in contact with 4 warships, including the recently commissioned light cruiser Belfast. Still, Prine did not engage them because they were too far away. Minutes later, a lookout spotted HMS Royal Oak at about 4,000 meters north of their position. Prine was frustrated about not encountering a bigger fish, but he ordered the crew to get ready to hunt her down. The submarine then slowly closed in, and at 12:58 a.m., she fired a salvo of 3 torpedoes and reloaded a 4th one. A few stressful seconds passed as the crew awaited the explosion, but nothing happened. It was then that an enraged Prine realized that 2 of the torpedoes had missed the target. Then, at 1:04 a.m., the 3rd torpedo hit the British ship. Royal Oak's crew dismissed the impact on the bow as a submarine strike and believed that it was due to the temperature of the munitions. Prine then turned the submarine and fired another salvo of 3 torpedoes that struck HMS Royal Oak 10 minutes later. The explosions blew a hole in the armored deck, causing the loss of electrical power, and igniting a magazine rapidly consumed the ship in flames. Royal Oak then rolled over and disappeared beneath the surface. 833 men, including Rear Admiral Henry Blagrove, lost their lives without knowing what had happened. Meanwhile, Prine and his crew celebrated, but there was no time to lose, and they quickly fled Scapa Flow to evade the British. The U-47's crewmen were greeted as heroes upon their return to Germany, and Prine was even nicknamed the Bull of Scapa Flow. Meanwhile, U-47 was decorated with a snorting bull that became the emblem of the 7th Flotilla. Hitler and Dönitz personally received Prine upon his arrival, and he became the first U-boat captain to be awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. The incredible feat soon became a topic of interest around the world, and it significantly increased the trust that Hitler had in the Kriegsmarine and his hopes that Great Britain would surrender without having to invade it. U-47 and her valiant captain would go on to sink over 30 Allied ships worth 200,000 tons, until she mysteriously disappeared during her 10th patrol in March of 1941, never to be seen again. Some historians have stated that the submarine was sunk on March 7th by HMS Wolverine west of Ireland, while other sources claim that she could have been lost due to a mechanical failure, a mine, or even a malfunctioning torpedo. The crew and its captain were mourned in Germany and are still remembered as some of the finest men that served in the Kriegsmarine. USS Tang was a Belau-class submarine that came into World War II as late as January of 1944. However, its performance would be unmatched during its short career. Tang would savagely harass the Japanese Navy and become a legend in the process, with Commander Richard O'Kane receiving the Medal of Honor for her last 2 engagements. The most successful U.S. submarine in Navy history sank 33 enemy ships in the span of 9 months, but would ultimately fall prey to its very own torpedo. In December of 1941, Mare Island Naval Shipyard was awarded a contract to build the USS Tang submarine. Tang's keel was laid down in January of 1943 and was launched 7 months later. The submarine was then commissioned in October under Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, the former executive officer of the highly successful USS Wahoo. The Belau-class diesel-electric submarine was delivered to the Navy 6 weeks later. It was crewed by 87 sailors and armed with 24 torpedoes. USS Tang was fitted out at Mare Island before moving to San Diego for training. The submarine then sailed to Hawaii and arrived at Pearl Harbor in January of 1944. 2 more weeks of exercises were required before going into combat. The submarine finally departed from the Hawaiian base on January 22nd and headed to the Caroline and Mariana Islands for its first war patrol. Almost 4 weeks later, Tang came across a Japanese convoy with 2 freighters, 5 smaller ships, and an escort. The American crew tracked the convoy and plotted the course. While preparing for an attack, an escort suddenly appeared at 7,000 yards while closing in. The submarine was forced to dive as deep as possible and underwent 5 depth charges. However, it avoided any damage and returned to periscope depth after the threat had passed. Tang then resumed its attack as the nearest freighter was roughly at 1,500 yards. The submarine fired 4 torpedoes, of which 3 hit the Gyoten Maru and sank it by the stern. After clearing the area, O'Kane planned for another assault at dawn, but the remaining freighter was protected by aircraft and escaped. On the night of February 22nd, Tang tracked and attacked 3 cargo ships and 2 escorts. The submarine shadowed the Japanese convoy through rain squalls, rendering its radars for the most part useless. Then, after 30 minutes, the submarine surfaced and struck, hitting Fukuyama Maru 4-fold and disintegrating her immediately. By the morning, Tang targeted the convoy's lead ship, Yamashima Maru, and fired 3 torpedoes. The ship spouted flames as it sank. 2 days later, the submarine sighted a tanker, a freighter, and a destroyer. Once again, rain squalls hampered the attack attempt. However, the submarine tracked the ships until past nightfall to get a good firing position, and then charged against the Tarutaki Maru-class freighter, scoring 3 hits and sinking her. The accompanying 2 ships then opened fire in all directions, and Tang began performing evasive maneuvers, submerging and tracking the enemy through the night. An opportunity to attack suddenly came from a dangerously close range. At merely 500 yards, the submarine was barely able to arm, but then fired and sank Echizen Maru. A depth charge attack against Tang ensued, which caused a water leak in the forward torpedo room. She then exceeded its maximum depth gauge, but the crew was able to control it and return to the surface. On February 26th, the boat spotted another Japanese convoy consisting of a freighter, transport, and 4 escorts. After positioning to attack, Tang launched its last 4 torpedoes and thought it had missed, but the Joint Army-Navy Committee later credited her with sinking the cargo ship Choko Maru. Out of 24 fired torpedoes, Tang had scored 16 hits. She then headed to Midway to refit. During Tang's second patrol, which started on March 16th, the submarine cruised the waters around the Palau Islands, the Davao Gulf, and the Truk Atoll. Despite making 5 surface contacts, Tang had no chance to attack and was therefore assigned to lifeguard duty. She then rescued 22 downed Navy airmen near Truk and got them safely to Hawaii. Her next mission took her to the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea. On her 3rd patrol, Tang sank more Japanese ships than any other submarine patrol during the war. By late June, the crew spotted a convoy with 6 large vessels, shielded by no less than 16 escorts southwest of Kagoshima. It was reported that 2 ships were then sunk in 2 consecutive spreads, but a post-war analysis revealed that it was actually 4 vessels. A week later, Tang came across a solitary cargo ship. The submarine chased the target and closed in to 750 yards. Though only 1 torpedo hit Nikin Maru, the ship was blown in half and dragged over 3,000 Japanese soldiers with her. The following morning, Tang sank a freighter but was evaded by a tanker that accompanied the ship. Still, the submarine chased the tanker and finally sank her past nightfall. By July 4th, there was another celebration with the sinking of Azkazan Maru. Moreover, Tang also sank Yamaoka Maru that same afternoon and went on to sink Dori Maru the following night. Tang's 4th patrol began on July 31st, and by August 11th, the submarine located 2 freighters and 2 escorts, launching 5 torpedoes against the freighters. Roku Maru, the larger one, exploded when a torpedo hit her boilers. As she began to sink, the crew heard the 4th and 5th torpedoes hitting the 2nd ship. Over the next 38 minutes, the submarine endured a rough depth charge attack. However, she quickly returned to periscope depth, from where she could make out the 2 Japanese escorts, with one of them retrieving survivors. 3 days later, Tang smashed a patrol yacht's deckhouse with its deck gun, and within a week, she sank a 225-foot patrol boat. Before returning to Pearl Harbor in late August, the submarine would sink another Grand ship and a tanker using the last of her torpedoes. Tang's final patrol called for the remarkable submarine to sail through a critical shipping route for the Nippon Empire, the Taiwan Strait. Commander O'Kane was given the option to join an attack group, but he decided that they would sail on their own. A succession of victories continued for a while, but its luck would eventually run out. On October 23rd, the crew came into contact with a large convoy of 3 tankers, a transport, and a freighter, accompanied by many escorts. O'Kane then prepared for a night surface attack. When they were ready, Tang broke into the Japanese formation and charged forward, firing torpedoes in all directions. Every single torpedo hit its mark, and several ships began burning or sinking. However, the attack came to a halt as the transport and a tanker attempted to ram the submarine. But she swiftly evaded them and caused them to impact each other. Then, as Tang headed for open water, she fired a round of 4 torpedoes and sank both vessels. In the morning, Tang surfaced and found that her radars were almost useless, showing too many blips. She then identified a vast convoy that included tankers and transport-carrying aircraft. As Tang tracked the convoy, the Japanese escorts began searching for her with a searchlight. The light also illuminated the Japanese ships, and Tang was able to choose her targets. She then fired 2 torpedoes at a substantial transport, 2 at a smaller one, and another 2 at a tanker. The submarine quickly paralleled the convoy and targeted her next victims, another transport and a tanker. Tang then escaped the area at full speed as the ships exploded and sank. At 2:30 in the morning on October 25th, Tang launched its last torpedo. The 24th projectile, a Mark 18 electric torpedo that was a copy of the German G7E, was known to malfunction. After launching it, the torpedo suddenly broached, curving to the left into a circular run. By the time the crew realized the torpedo was heading straight towards them, they had barely 15 seconds before impact. The skipper then ordered to accelerate immediately, fishtailing under emergency power. But Tang struggled to get ahead of the torpedo, and it was too late. 20 seconds after firing, the Mark 18 warhead struck the empty aft torpedo room, and half the 87-man crew perished on the spot. The rear compartments flooded rapidly, sinking the submarine's stern first, but the buoyancy of the unflooded bow kept it above the surface. The commanding officer and 2 other men on the bridge managed to swim to the surface. One officer swam out of the conning tower, but could not close the hatch. Eventually, the boat bottomed at 180 feet. About 30 men crowded the forward torpedo room and burned sensitive documents, but a Japanese depth charge assault delayed their escape, and a fire in the forward battery worsened the situation. However, some sailors managed to escape, and it was the first time that there were survivors from a sunken U.S. submarine without assistance from the surface. In addition, it was also the first time that a rebreather known as the Momsen lung was employed to escape. Out of 13 sailors who got out of the forward torpedo room, only 8 reached the surface, and just 5 survived. 9 survivors were eventually picked up by a Japanese frigate. Some of the enemy crew had escaped previous sinkings by the submarine, and they wanted revenge. O'Kane later said, quote, "When we realized that our clubbing and kickings were being administered by the burned, mutilated survivors of our handiwork, we found we could take it with less prejudice." The 9 American survivors were taken as prisoners for the remainder of the war. USS Tang received 4 battle stars and 2 Presidential Unit citations for her service during World War II, and Commander Richard O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor. After the war, it was confirmed that Tang sank a total of 33 ships during its short career, amounting to 116,454 tons. This feat was unequaled by any other American submarine, and Tang is regarded as the most successful submarine from World War II. It also retains the record as the best patrol by the number of ships she sunk. The submarine went on to appear in several films, TV shows, and video games, and she's memorialized at the interactive exhibit in the National World War II Museum of New Orleans. As World War I ended, and the British people were slowly returning to their regular lives, the European powers signed an armistice, sealing the conditions of the renewed peace. Under the agreed terms, Germany had to surrender its fleet to the victors by early 1919. Soon, France got hold of the colossal U-118 submarine, one of the largest at the time, and within a couple of months, the vessel was traveling to her new home. However, a severe storm ripped the submarine from her convoy and dragged her far away to the southern English coast. The people of Hastings woke up the next morning to an uncanny sight, a souvenir from the war beached on their own shore. During World War I, the Imperial German Navy had 9 submarines in its UE-2 class of ocean mine layers among its entire fleet of 329 submarines. One of them was SMU-118, which would make a name for herself after the conflict. The model was 81.5 meters long and reached a speed of 11.5 knots when surfaced and 7 knots when submerged. Her test depth was 75 meters, and her entire crew consisted of 36 men. The U-boat was built at the A.G. Vulcanstetten shipyard in Hamburg and was launched on February 23, 1918, just months before the war came to an end. Commissioned on May 8th, she was under the command of Herbert Stowasser. U-118 joined the first flotilla operation in the Eastern Atlantic and served in the naval encounters of the First Battle of the Atlantic. However, it wasn't until after 4 months of operation that U-118 scored her first hit. On September 16th, the British cargo steamer Wellington was sailing from Newport in the United States to Naples, Italy, loaded with a cargo of coal and escorted by the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Seneca. Suddenly, 175 miles northwest of Cape Villano, she crossed paths with the German submarine. U-118 immediately launched a torpedo attack that crippled the steamer, which managed to stay afloat as her escort struggled to save her. 11 sailors from Wellington's crew and another 20 from Seneca volunteered to try to get the sinking vessel to Brest in France. But as Seneca departed to join the rest of the convoy, Wellington filled with water at the bow, and her pumps worked full stop to fight the leakage. Still, her engines could only manage 7 knots, and then a storm struck. The sizable storm battered the entire company, and the men swiftly took to the rafts and abandoned the sinking ship. The cold and heavy seas ultimately claimed 11 lives from Seneca and 5 from Wellington, including her captain, while the survivors were rescued by USS Warrington. U-118's next prey would not be so lucky. 2 weeks after her first victory, the U-boat came across a highly armed British merchant ship called Arca. It was October 2nd when the submarine spotted the vulnerable vessel about 40 miles from Tory Island in Ireland. Arca was on a voyage from Philadelphia to Portishead, carrying a payload of benzene. Without warning, the German ship torpedoed the unaware British sailors, and the vessel sank quickly, dragging 52 hands with her, including the master. During her first and only patrol, U-118 sank 2 British ships. Stowasser claimed 5,600 tons of the collier Wellington and 4,839 tons of Arca before the armistice of November 11, 1918, brought the war to an end. With the ending of hostilities, the Imperial German Navy capitulated, and her vessels were surrendered to the victors. Then, on February 23, 1919, the anniversary of her launch, U-118 was surrendered and lined up for transfer to France, where she would be broken up for scrap. However, in the early hours of April 15th, U-118 and another German submarine were on tow through the English Channel off Beachy Head when a heavy storm bashed the vessels and broke their dragging hawsers. When one of the submarines was driven ashore near Cuckmere, U-118 drifted away eastwards towards Sussex in the middle of the night. At 12:45 a.m. on April 15th, the immense underwater craft beached in front of Herald Place, right at the foot of the Queen's Hotel in the town of Hastings. In the morning, the locals awoke to an unusual sight on the shore: a colossal ship marooned on the sand. The nearby Coast Guard station in Marine Parade immediately took control of the situation. Indeed, seeing one of the Kaiser's U-boats aground on their island caused some shock among the inhabitants, but they couldn't help but be amused. Thousands gathered on the beach and flocked to take a glimpse of the gigantic submarine, which was, in fact, among the largest of her time. The impressive vessel became an unusual Easter attraction, and for a fortnight, the Admiralty allowed the town clerk to charge a fee of 6 pennies for visitors who wanted to climb on her deck. In addition, for a more exclusive and in-depth tour, 2 members of the Coast Guard, Chief Boatman William Hurd and Chief Officer W. Moore, were assigned to show important visitors the inside of the submarine, while the multitude of sightseers congregated all around her. The submarine became a huge attraction right away, and the Hastings Council collected about £300, or about $15,500 in today's currency, for the Mayor's Welcome Home Fund. This organization gave a proper welcome to soldiers returning home from the war. After a couple weeks, and only a handful of incursions leading the tours below deck, Hurd and Moore fell gravely ill with severe internal pains. The cause was unclear at first, with suspicions that the stench of rotting vegetables and meat lying in water in the afterchamber could be behind it. But as the illness worsened, its actual cause proved more gruesome. By the end of April, the tour guides were too sick to continue with their task. As the sickness not only persisted but grew worse, all attempts to save the guards were futile. Moore perished that December, and Hurd followed 2 months later. The visits were thus curtailed until the mystery was solved, but it was later determined that the culprit was a chlorine gas leak escaping from the ship's batteries. The toxic fumes inflicted several abscesses on the lungs and even the brains of the unfortunate Coast Guards. The illnesses first resembled pneumonia, but it then became clear that they were caused by inhaling the noxious gases. After the visits stopped, there were attempts to displace the stricken ship. 3 tractors tried to refloat the submarine, and a destroyer even tried to dismantle U-118 with cannon fire, but they all failed. Moreover, the proximity of the wreck site to the public beach and the hotel dissuaded further attempts and the use of explosive forces. The stranded vessel then remained at that exact location for 6 months. Even though trips inside the submarine were banned, tourists still came to be photographed alongside or on top of U-118's deck. However, residents eventually grew tired of children pelting the ship with rocks and the endless racket of noises throughout the night. Soon after, an order was given to scrap the submarine, and the British Admiralty sold the wreck to James Dredging Corporation on May 21, 1919, for a total of £2,200. Between 1919 and 1921, many ships were lost on transfer while being towed, and most surrendered U-boats were scrapped. However, scrap steel prices were so low in the post-war that the Royal Navy was not able to sell all of its surrendered U-boats. As such, many were simply taken out to sea and scuttled. Between October and December of 1919, U-118 was broken up into pieces and sold in bits. Parts of the vessel were removed and sold for scrap, while others were snatched and dispersed all over town. Hastings was presented with the submarine's gun in memory of the occurrence, but it was left behind on the sand, and it did not take long before it was buried in the shingle by the waves. Nevertheless, it was dug up and disposed of in 1921, despite petitions to mount it on a plinth and keep it permanently in commemoration of the event. While U-118 was mostly lost, the keel is believed to remain under the beach to this day. The fire that erupted in the rear compartment of the submarine was unstoppable. Captain Vanine had sealed the burning sections, but the flames still spread. While most of the crew had already made it to safety, Vanine and 4 crewmen stayed to figure out how to save K-278 Komsomolets, a one-of-a-kind submarine with nuclear capabilities. After attempting the inevitable, Vanine and the sailors desisted and rushed to the escape hatch, but they were far from salvation. A flaw in the hatch caused it to explosively decompress, knocking the men out except one. Outside the submarine, the crew faced a different challenge: the icy waters of the Norwegian Sea. During the Cold War, Soviet engineers approached submarine design and development in a way that contrasted with their American counterparts. Soviet Navy doctrine called for submarines that could outrun and outdive their enemies in swift and devastating underwater dogfights. As a result, most Soviet submarines were faster, more agile, and tougher than the U.S. Navy opponents. Double-hull designs allowed Soviet Union submarines to withstand more damage and dive twice as deep at over 500 meters. Nevertheless, they also had weaknesses. They were noisier, which allowed U.S. Navy submarines to easily detect them. Furthermore, Russian submarines had deficient radiation shielding, resulting in high accident rates. The Soviet Navy sought to eliminate these deficiencies in the late 1960s and issued requirements for developing a new submarine to become the testbed of fourth-generation submarines. It was dubbed Project 685 and was meant to test the latest submarine technologies that could blend stealth, maneuverability, and attack mechanics required for submarine warfare. The task fell upon the Rubin Design Bureau, which devised a design that could carry a mix of torpedoes and cruise missiles with conventional and nuclear warheads. It took Rubin almost a decade to develop the submarine. Although work and design began in approximately 1966, it was not done until 1974. The submarine's keel was laid down on April 22, 1978, and she was launched on June 3, 1983. The submarine was designated K-278 Komsomolets, or member of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League. She was the only one of her kind. Development of Project 685 took so long because she was built entirely out of titanium alloy 48T, a material rarely used for submarines, generally made of steel. The Soviets had followed this trend and had learned to work with titanium. Although extremely expensive, it was twice as strong as steel and much lighter. Komsomolets' hull could withstand 1,500 psi of pressure from the ocean thanks to her double hull configuration, split into 7 compartments. These were the torpedo room, control room, electrical motors, reactor compartment, turbines, auxiliary mechanisms, and accommodations room. A unique escape pod located in the conning tower allowed the crew to safely abandon the ship in case of an emergency. Project 685 displaced over 5,700 tons surfaced and over 8,000 tons fully submerged. She was armed with 2 SSN-15 Starfish RPK-2 Vyoga, 2 SSN-16 Stallion missiles, and 6 21-inch torpedo tubes at the bow with a standard load of 22 torpedoes. The main submarine systems were 1 Snoophead surface search radar and 1 Sharkgill low-frequency active sonar. The submarine could achieve speeds of 14 knots surfaced and some 30 knots below water. Komsomolets' propulsion system comprised 1 190-megawatt OK-650B3 pressurized water reactor, 2 steam turbines, and 1 7-blade propeller. She had a crew of up to 68 men, integrated by 32 officers, 21 warrant officers, and 15 enlisted sailors. The men could endure 50 days at sea with the proper supplies. The submarine could operate under full power for roughly 4,500 hours. Komsomolets had a length of almost 120 meters, a draft of 9 meters, and a beam of 12 meters. All in all, a formidable vessel that would soon be put to the test. After her launch in June 1983, Komsomolets spent 4 years under trials and rigorous tests. In 1984, she dove 1,020 meters deep in the Sea of Norway, making her the first military submarine to do so. In April 1989, Komsomolets was dispatched for her first mission under Captain Evgeny Vanin. She was sent to the southwest of Bear Island, Norway, for patrol. At 11:03 a.m. on April 7th, the submarine was sailing at a depth of 386 meters when suddenly, high-pressure air hoses connected to the ballast tank burst their seal. As a result, the hoses damaged an oil container that leaked oil into a hot turbine and sparked a fire. The pressurized air expanded the blaze into the nuclear reactor's emergency shutdown. This led to an immediate loss of power in Komsomolets' hydraulics. Captain Vanin sealed the rear compartment to stop the fire, but it spread through the other compartments. With the crew's luck running out, the captain gave the order to blow off the ballast tanks to bring the submarine to the surface. The majority of the crew made it to the deck, but the captain and 4 crewmen stayed in an attempt to save the submarine. At 4:30 p.m., Komsomolets began to sink with the increasing fire. Vanin and his sailors made it to the escape hatch, but it explosively decompressed, fatally wounding 2 crewmen and injuring the other 2. Over 34 of the surviving crewmen perished in the freezing waters of Norway before a relief effort arrived to rescue them. The loss of Captain Vanin and 41 of his sailors out of a crew of 69 caused an uproar in Russia. In 1993, a charity was created to help the families of deceased crew members and other sailors lost in similar accidents. Following the sinking of K-278 Komsomolets and her crew in the Barents Sea in April 1989, the wreck site remained undisturbed for some years. As the Soviet Union crumbled, few paid attention to the catastrophe and its environmental repercussions. Nevertheless, Soviet investigators returned in August 1991 to the resting place of the colossal submarine to examine the wreck. The specialists employed manned submersibles to take samples and analyze the submarine's hull. The team discovered that, as told by the survivors, an explosion had occurred in the bow, where the torpedoes with nuclear warheads were fitted. 1 year later, a second expedition was launched and included a team of scientists, one of whom was a Norwegian. The Scandinavian country had been taking samples since early 1990 and had found elevated concentrations of the radioactive substance cesium-137 near the wreck. This second expedition extensively tested organisms, bottom sediments, and water. The scientists tried to raise the submarine, but realized it was impossible due to the extensive damage to the hull. According to the U.S. Center for the Study of Intelligence, or CSI, in 1993, a team of Russians, Americans, Dutch, and Norwegians discovered a massive hole in the forward torpedo compartment. Although no hull deterioration or excess radiation was found, it was decided to seal the corroding torpedoes as soon as possible to prevent further leaks. In mid-1994, the fourth expedition discovered plutonium leakage from one of the two nuclear-armed torpedoes. According to the CSI report, Tengiz Borisov, head of the Russian Special Committee for the Conduct of Underwater Work, told reporters, quote, "If there is a leak, fishing will be impossible in the Norwegian Sea for between 600 and 700 years." On June 24, 1995, the Russian oceanographic research ship Keldysh set sail from St. Petersburg to Komsomolets rest site to seal the hull fractures in the torpedo compartment and cover the nuclear warheads. The operation was not easy, but the Russians accomplished it by July 1996. A jelly-like sealant ensured the wreck site would be safe from radiation for 25 to 30 years until about 2025. The Norwegian Radiation Agency and the Marine Environmental Agency agreed to take yearly water and ground samples from the wreck site to follow the radiation levels. In 1997, the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment published a study about the impact of the sunken submarine on the environment. It determined that, quote, "Neither the submarine hull nor the reactor vessel will be destroyed by corrosion for at least 1,000 years. Nevertheless, the radiation threat was far from over, and there was still more work and research to be done about the area near the wreckage. In 2007, the Norwegians found leakage from one ventilation pipe of the wreck. According to Michael Scollin and Stuart Greer, authors of the article Komsomolets Wreck Site Reveals High Radiation Levels 30 Years After Soviet Sub Sinks, 5 samples were taken and analyzed in a joint Russian-Norwegian expedition in 2019. Each of them had different levels of radioactive contamination. 4 showed between 30,000 and 100,000 levels of contamination higher than those found in uncontaminated water. The 5th sample was over 800,000 higher than normal. Despite the sealing of the torpedo compartment, Komsomolets had been leaking radiation the whole time. Despite this, Hilda Elise Heldal, a researcher from the Institute of Marine Research, noted that there was no cause for alarm. She explained that any pollution is quickly diluted, and radiation has never extended beyond a meter away from the ventilation pipe. Heldal concluded that even in the worst-case scenario, leaked radiation from the submarine would not impact the fish in the Barents Sea due to the wreck being located at such a great depth. She said, quote, "I can tell you from the monitoring we do on radioactive pollution and fish from these areas that fish and seafood from these areas are absolutely safe to eat. For now, the unique Soviet submarine will remain buried in the depths, as there are no plans to raise it to prevent lethal radiation leaks." The Virginia-class nuclear-powered cruise missile fast attack submarine is the latest vessel in the United States Navy's arsenal. The design incorporates the latest in stealth, intelligence, and weapon systems technology to be applied for special deep-ocean anti-submarine warfare and littoral operations. A formidable weapons platform, the attack submarine can launch up to 16 Tomahawk cruise missiles in a single salvo, but the remarkable feat is not enough for the Navy. The Virginia-class vessels are set to become the first submarines in the world armed with high-energy laser weapons. However, a big hurdle is standing in the way. Lasers don't seem to work underwater. Still, the Navy continues to work on the model, and most of the system's capabilities are yet to be unveiled. But the expectations are that Virginia's laser weapon could radically change naval warfare forever. The USS Seawolf-class nuclear-powered fast-attack submarines were initially intended to provide a replacement for the Los Angeles-class, an aged series that saw action during the Cold War. However, by the time the first model was actually commissioned, strategic requirements had changed, budgets had shifted, and the Soviet Union had fallen. As such, the production of the most expensive U.S. Navy fast attack submarine was canceled after only 3 models were produced. Years later, in 1991, the Navy began the development of the next generation of attack submarines. Developed under the codename Centurion, later renamed the Virginia class, the model was intended to be a less expensive alternative to the Seawolf, with a $1 billion budget difference. In order to reduce costs, Virginia-class engineers used many commercial off-the-shelf components, and ongoing technology has trimmed production costs even further, below the $1.8 billion per submarine price tag. By 2007, more than 35 million labor hours had been spent on the Virginia-class construction. The Virginia class, also known as the SSN 774 class, is a type of nuclear-powered cruise missile fast attack submarine in service with the United States Navy, going back to the early 2000s. The first American nuclear-powered cruise missile fast attack submarine of the post-war era, she'll provide the U.S. Navy the capabilities required to maintain undersea supremacy well into the 21st century. As the service's newest undersea warfare platform, the Virginia-class submarine incorporates all the latest available technology, as well as unique warfare enhancements. With these improvements, the class is tailored to excel in a wide range of warfighting missions, including seeking and destroying enemy submarines and surface ships, projecting power ashore with Tomahawk cruise missiles, and special operation forces, carrying out intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, supporting battlegroup operations, and engaging in mine warfare. With a total length of 377 feet, displacing approximately 7,800 tons fully submerged, the submarine can sail at a top speed of 25 knots. Meanwhile, her crew consists of 15 officers and 117 enlisted men. The initial construction contract for the first 4 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, Virginia, Texas, Hawaii, and North Carolina, was awarded to Electric Boat Corporation, with Newport News Shipbuilding serving as the primary subcontractor in September of 1998. As of 2022, 22 Virginia-class submarines have been completed, and a total of 36 have been procured through the fiscal year. A team of shipbuilders, industry suppliers, and the Navy consistently deliver them under budget and ahead of schedule. The Virginia class has special features to support special operation forces, depending on the mission, and the traditional periscopes have been replaced by 2 photonics masts. First created in the 1990s, photonics masts have 360-degree rotating cameras that catch anything on the horizon with high-resolution black and white footage. The submarine's torpedo room can even be reconfigured to house a large number of special operations forces, complete with all their equipment for prolonged deployments. However, in addition to the submarine's advanced capability torpedoes and Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, the Virginia class may soon add another technology to its already impressive features. According to open-source budget documents, Virginia-class submarines will be equipped with a high-energy laser weapon. This was further confirmed by a United States Naval Postgraduate School's lengthy study regarding the integration of a high-energy laser, or HEL, into the class. On the other hand, the Navy itself published a thesis summary, but officials withheld further details. Available information suggests that the HEL could be incredibly powerful, with a range of up to 500 kilowatts, powered by the submarine's nuclear reactor. It is even said that it may already have been tested using a towed power generator, and that the laser will most likely be incorporated into the photonics masts. On land and air, laser weapons strike at the speed of light, quickly deploying to every possible fighting domain. However, laser light scatters and absorbs quickly while underwater, much like sunlight. With the submarine reaching complete darkness past 3,280 feet, it would seemingly render laser weapons useless. Still, there are a few suggestions for applications for such laser technology. Without much available information, submarine experts outside the military have speculated why the Navy wants to fit a laser onto submarines. One of the possible uses for the novel laser technology is as a modern defense mechanism against aircraft such as drones and anti-submarine helicopters. While earlier submarines were equipped with machine guns as an on-the-surface defense, post-war ones spent little to no time above water. In fact, the United States Navy hasn't installed machine guns on submarines for over 70 years. The laser could also be intended for North Korean and Iranian speedboat swarms. While individual ones are not worth launching a torpedo for, their wildly unmatched speeds actually make a successful attack much harder. Finally, another option is to strike critical coastal targets like radar stations, communications masts, or submarine piers. With United States Navy officials refusing to speak to the press about the mysterious laser project, its exact function and the types of targets it is projected to attack remain a mystery. And while it may be years before the full capabilities of the system are revealed, this laser could be what sets this submarine apart from all the other active ones in the world. The Virginia-class submarine design has been updated multiple times since 1998. All the innovations ensure that the ship will be affordable in enough numbers to satisfy America's future nuclear attack submarine force level requirements. As such, the Virginia-class construction blocks have continued to evolve since the first submarine was commissioned in 2004. Each successive block has incorporated additional capabilities and advanced technology while reducing costs. And just like the last Los Angeles-class attack submarines, the first two blocks of the Virginia-class have a vertical launch system in the bow, with space for 12 Tomahawk missiles. However, starting with Block 3, two key design changes were made, including replacing a traditional sonar sphere with a more modern large-aperture bow array, and the vertical system with two large payload tubes, each carrying 6 missiles. In addition, as part of the carrier's third or Block 3 contract, the Navy redesigned approximately 20% of the ship to reduce acquisition costs. This design change resulted in the reduction of the overall procurement costs by 30% without compromising any vital aspects, allowing for the construction of 2 Virginia-class attack submarines per year beginning in 2011. Moreover, the Virginia Payload Module was the next significant design change to the class, starting with Block 5. Also called the VPM, it is a new 84-foot section, inserted into the existing submarine design that contains an additional 4 large-diameter payload tubes, like the ones added in Block 3. But unlike the bow payload tubes, the VPM ones can each carry 7 Tomahawk missiles, upping the total number to 28. The first VPM-equipped submarine began construction in 2019. These soon-to-be-introduced VPM-equipped submarines are the most cost-effective way to restore the Navy's undersea strike capacity, which will drop by 60% when the Ohio-class submarine force is retired by the decade's end. The promising technology in the United States program has not gone unnoticed by the international export market. In September of 2021, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced the cancellation of a contract with a French shipbuilder to construct 12 attack-class diesel submarines based upon the French Navy's Barracuda-class nuclear sub. The same day, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States announced the AUKUS, or UK-US Trilateral Security Pact. With the agreement, the United States agreed to share nuclear propulsion technology with Australia and the UK. Under AUKUS, the Australian Navy is set to acquire at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines, with the overall design and key technologies decided by a research team with assistance from the other 2 nations. It is rumored that Australian officials may select the Virginia design or use most of its nuclear propulsion technology in a new design. Back in the United States, the Virginia-class submarines will be acquired through 2043 and are expected to remain in service until at least 2070. As the threats to national security in the 7 oceans continue to evolve, the submarine industrial base design will continue to change, and it will all be achieved through extensive modular construction, open architecture, and commercial off-the-shelf components. Such submarines might be the right vehicles for the United States Navy's most critical underwater missions, complete with a strange and mysterious laser beam, well into the 21st century. Operation Ivy Bells was an American secret mission launched by the U.S. Navy, the NSA, and the CIA, whose objective was to place wiretaps on Soviet underwater communications lines to collect as much information as possible from their opponents during the arms race. To achieve this goal, the Navy heavily modified USS Halibut with state-of-the-art sensors and equipment that no other submarine of its time had. For over 10 years, the United States wiretapped Soviet communications channels in the Sea of Okhotsk with a unique recording device deployed by Navy divers. It would not be until 1980 that the Soviets found out they were being spied upon, and the tip came from within the US. As the conflict in North Korea reached an end in 1953 and the war in Vietnam loomed on the horizon, the United States grew concerned about the nuclear capabilities of the Soviet Union. Although the United States was now more advanced in nuclear technology in the aftermath of World War II, the Soviets caught up sooner than expected. In 1949, Joseph Stalin celebrated that the Soviet Union had finally made the first successful nuclear device detonation, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, would come next. With the help of thousands of captured German scientists and the footprints of the powerful V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, the Soviet scientists did not waste precious time to outmatch their American rivals. For these reasons, the US government and its allies began to look for more effective ways to collect intelligence on Russia's latest weapon developments. Aircraft reconnaissance was valuable, but after the U-2 accident of May 1, 1960, in which the Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane, manned by CIA operator Francis Gary Powers flying over Soviet territory, the US needed to go deeper. The solution would come in the early 1970s, before the Vietnam War reached an end. The US soon found out about an undersea communication cable that connected the Soviet Pacific Fleet naval base at Petropavlovsk to the main quarters at Vladivostok. The secret line was located in the depths of the Sea of Okhotsk, between the Russian mainland and the Kamchatka Peninsula. However, access to the area was limited for non-Soviet vessels, since the Soviet Union had claimed it as territorial waters. The Soviets had even installed sound devices at the bottom of the sea to detect any intrusion attempts, and to further protect the area, naval exercises were conducted nearby to have more manpower available if something occurred. Despite the odds, the US considered that it was worth the risk, as the benefits of getting inside the Soviet network could dramatically change the course of the Cold War. As a result, Operation Ivy Bells was born, with Captain James F. Bradley, Jr. in charge of the classified operation. Captain Bradley, a World War II and Vietnam War veteran, was one of the first officers who suggested the possibility of a wiretapping operation. Like a seasoned sailor, Bradley was used to close encounters with the enemy, and he did not fear sailing through waters infested with Soviet warships and submarines. In 1966, Bradley became the Undersea Warfare Director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, where he became known for his aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. 2 years later, Bradley operated a covert operation in the Pacific aboard USS Halibut in search of the remnants of Soviet submarine K-129. The Soviet submarine was thought to be lost due to an internal explosion and had not been found by the Soviet Navy. Still, Bradley believed they had better chances thanks to a state-of-the-art device called the Fish. The Fish was a 2-ton underwater camera valued at $5 million that was mounted inside a mini-submarine tethered to Halibut. Thanks to this device, Project Azorian also gathered valuable intelligence about Soviet submarines. However, Halibut was not ready to embark on this wiretapping mission, and Bradley believed that it needed significant repairs. Bradley was also convinced that the Soviet cable was vulnerable and unencrypted because of the depth at which it was found. He claimed that the Soviets were aware that a mission to wiretap the cable would be impossible, and consequently no one would even try it. Extreme secrecy was required for the submarine's upgrades, as the Soviets could not learn about the mission, or else it would be compromised before it even started. By the time the mission was ready to be launched in the fall of 1971, the Navy had already come up with a cover story. To justify sending the USS Halibut submarine into the Sea of Okhotsk, the Navy claimed it would be searching for the remains of a Soviet SSN-12 Sandbox supersonic anti-ship missile to collect thousands of pieces of debris and study them properly to develop countermeasures. Few men knew about the real objective of Operation Ivy Bells, including sailors and divers from USS Halibut and Navy personnel, and the funds to upgrade Halibut were secretly diverted from the Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle Program, or DSRV. This vehicle was meant to rescue submariners in the event of an underwater accident. The Navy equipped Halibut with what looked like a DSRV, but it was a diver lockout outfitted with special equipment and gadgets called the Bat Cave. Like the Halibut Flatfish itself, USS Halibut was already a strange-looking submarine that looked even weirder with the added modifications. Halibut was built as a long-range missile submarine, and it was the first to carry the large turbojet-powered Regulus II cruise missile. Regulus was launched from the submarine's deck through a ramp that led towards the ship's bow, where other missiles were stored. These platforms resulted in a unique appearance that resembled a snake digesting a big prey. Standing 350 feet long, with a 29-foot beam and weighing 5,000 tons, Halibut was also equipped with 6 533mm torpedo tubes. In addition, its S-3W reactor gave it an underwater speed of more than 20 knots and unlimited range. By 1965, Halibut received an overhaul of over $70 million to house the fish cameras later used by Captain Bradley in 1968. The missiles in the internal bay were also replaced by a photographic darkroom, a 24-bit mainframe computer, and hatches for divers to enter and exit the submarine while fully submerged. As the diver lockout was being developed, Bradley's next objective was to find a way for Navy divers to stay 400 feet below water for several hours. The answer lay in helium or saturation diving to prevent divers from suffering nitrogen narcosis, a decompression sickness, which resulted in a fatal embolism if the body did not decompress properly. Another issue was to find the exact location of the Soviet cable. Bradley remembered his days as a boy in the Mississippi River and recalled that sailors used warning signs near utility lines. He then concluded that the Soviets would probably have similar signs to prevent any accidental damages to warn local fishermen. With that in mind, the mission was now ready to launch. When USS Halibut finally arrived at the Sea of Okhotsk in October of 1971, Bradley grinned. The Soviets had indeed placed warning signs. Once Halibut located the cable, it fully submerged and allowed the Navy sailors to begin the job. To tap the communication cable without compromising it, Bradley and his men used an induction technique. The divers placed a 20-foot-long apparatus around the 5-inch width of the cable without cutting it. They then wrapped a connector around the communication line and fed it into a reel-to-reel tape recorder. If the cable was ever raised, the device was designed to automatically fall off. Once the divers made sure everything was placed accordingly, they returned to the submarine and called it mission accomplished. From November 1971 onwards, the Navy sent divers every month to retrieve and replace the recording tapes. These recordings were then handed to the National Security Agency for analysis. As the years went by, the US Navy began tapping more Soviet lines around the world, and the Soviets never realized they were being spied upon. The minds behind the device were from AT&T's Bell Laboratories, and they eventually improved their instruments and created nuclear-powered devices that could gather data for almost an entire year. Besides USS Halibut, other submarines such as USS Seawolf, USS Parch, and USS Richard B. Russell were later fitted with the same espionage upgrades. The gathered intelligence provided the US with enough information about the latest Soviet nuclear developments and how much they feared American weaponry, and gave the government almost 10 years' worth of data from Soviet communications. Unfortunately, an ex-NSA agent by the name of Ronald Pelton tipped off the KGB in exchange for over $40,000 to get out of his bankruptcy in 1980. A year later, a Soviet fleet arrived at the Sea of Okhotsk to remove the device. The US had sent USS Parch to recover it, but it was too late. The recording device is now on display at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow. USS Halibut earned a Presidential and Navy Unit citation in 1972 for its role in the operation, and was eventually decommissioned in 1975 after more than 1,200 dives and 16 years of service. To this day, several analysts credit the findings from Operation Ivy Bells with the de-escalation of the Cold War. As World War II was nearing its end in the early winter of 1944, the oceans were still a highly dangerous place for merchant vessels. Still, the emblematic Liberty ships of the U.S. fleet continued serving in every corner of the globe. On Christmas Eve, the Robert J. Walker Liberty ship took off from Calcutta on her way to Sydney without an escort and bordered the country via Fremantle while crossing the Great Australian Bight. The defenseless freighter was very confident about traveling through seemingly safe Allied waters, as no German submarines were ever deployed in the Australian oceans during the war. That is, except for U-862, whose historical journey marked the only time that Nazis operated U-boats in the region during the conflict. As the ships met face to face, Robert J. Walker suffered the brunt of Korvettenkapitan Heinrich Timm's stealthy charge. Stunned, the American crew responded immediately, but as the gunners took up their positions, they saw yet another trail of bubbles hundreds of yards away. It was another torpedo coming directly at them, but the sailors would not go down without a fight. Even though the concept of Liberty-class cargo ships was British, the United States adopted the design for its simplicity and low production cost. Under British orders, the class was developed as a replacement for ships lost during the early stages of the war, especially given the threat of German U-boats roaming the oceans. As early as 1936, the U.S. Merchant Marine passed an act to subsidize the annual construction of 50 commercial merchant ships that could be deployed during wartime. By 1940, that number had quadrupled, but the era's industrial capacity ultimately limited the number of ships that were built. That same year, the British government requested 60 ocean-class freighters from American yards. Simple, but rather large, the single steam engine model was somewhat obsolete, though still reliable in times of need. Early designs featured a simple tramp steamer, which was cheap both to build and to run. The requirements called for an 18-inch increase in draft, and the change aimed to boost displacement from 800 long tons to 10,000 long tons. Located amidships were the accommodation, bridge, and main engine, which was connected to the propeller via a long aft extension. The United States Maritime Commission modified the design later on, with the changes addressing the conformity with American construction practices. More importantly, they allowed for cheaper and speedier production. After that, the American version was designated for emergency cargo, or EC2-SC1, and much of the riveting was replaced with welding, significantly reducing labor costs. When the Merchant Marine Act adopted the design, production was awarded to a West Coast conglomerate known as the Six Companies. Notably, Henry J. Kaiser led the association. Even though Liberty ships were initially intended to carry 10,000 tons of cargo, the wartime demands often saw them carry loads far exceeding that limit. Moreover, the Liberty ship was mass-produced on an unprecedented scale, and eventually came to symbolize U.S. wartime industrial output. Between 1941 and 1945, 18 American shipyards built no less than 2,710 examples, averaging 3 ships every 2 days. This was the largest number of ships produced from a single design by far. However, early in her career, the model had a poor public image because of her appearance. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt once referred to it as a, quote, dreadful-looking object in a speech announcing the emergency shipbuilding program, while Time magazine called it the ugly duckling. In an effort to assuage public opinion, September 27, 1941 was dubbed Liberty Fleet Day. That day, the first 14 emergency vessels were launched by President Roosevelt himself. In his speech, the president cited Patrick Henry, who shared his name with the first Liberty ship, and recalled Henry's closing words during a 1775 address, quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." The German U-862 was among the most traveled submarines in the nation's fleet. Commissioned in 1943, she was commanded by then-Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Timm for her entire career in the Kriegsmarine. Timm was a highly decorated pre-war sailor and wartime submariner with fighting experience in the Arctic and the Baltic Seas. The submarine sailed for her first patrol in May of 1944 on her way to Penang in the then Japanese-occupied Malaya, the base of the codenamed Monsoon Group, the 33rd U-boat flotilla. Once, after launching a Zhaokuning-1 acoustic homing torpedo at a tanker during that mission, the mine turned around full circle and headed directly towards the submarine. However, the U-boat performed an emergency crash dive in absolute silence, effectively evading her own torpedo. U-862 also downed a Royal Air Force Catalina flying boat and furtively escaped an intense Allied search for her during that first patrol. Timm was then promoted to Korvettenkapitan in early July, and before reaching her destination in September, the U-boat sank several merchant ships in the Mozambique Channel between Africa and Madagascar. The submarine sailed for her second patrol 3 months later, departing from Japanese-occupied Batavia in the Dutch East Indies. She then traveled across the Great Australian Bight through Australia's west coast and around Tasmania's southern shore. On December 24, 1944, while on her return trip north towards Sydney, and 218 days after having left Germany, the submarine came across an Allied freighter about 60 miles south of Jervis Bay. Liberty-class freighter Robert J. Walker was en route from Calcutta to Sydney via Fremantle, under the command of Master Murdoch D. McRae, and had 69 men on board, including 10 officers, 32 merchant crew, 26 armed guards, and 1 passenger. The merchant ship traveled unescorted 165 miles southwest of Sydney, confident that no German vessels had roamed Australian waters during the war. Then, at 4:30 p.m., Robert J. Walker was steaming on a zigzag course at 10.8 knots when Tim fired a first torpedo, striking the ship on her stern starboard side. The impact blew off the rudder and left a 3-foot by 6-foot hole. Plus, her shaft was bent and the steering gear completely destroyed. Now utterly unmaneuverable, the ship steered southwards, but at around 6:20 p.m., the Germans launched a second attack. By then, the brave merchant crew were ready at their deck posts, and they quickly spotted the incoming torpedo. Seaman First Class Harold Stone, an anti-aircraft gunner armed with a 20mm quick-firing Oerlikon gun, then opened fire at the advancing mine, and a giant blast suddenly threw water and smoke into the air. Tim watched the scene in utter exasperation and assumed that the torpedo had struck home. However, the freighter remained afloat after having accomplished an unprecedented feat that would not be repeated during the entirety of the war. Hitting the German torpedo bought the American crew a little more time to respond, though not much. As McRae's men screened the vessel and threw smoke floats overboard, they gained about 45 minutes. During this time, the captain sent a distress call, and plenty of warships from Sydney and Jervis Bay, as well as aircraft from the Rathmines base near Lake Macquarie, were soon deployed to the rescue. Still, the attack had just begun. The Germans suddenly fired a third torpedo, and despite the sailors' skillful response, it struck the vessel at the number 4 hold. An immense 10-foot by 20-foot hole was ruptured on the starboard, and another one, 6-foot by 8-foot, opened up on the port side. Also, deep tank number 3 was damaged, throwing oil and water over the ship. After the second hit, the crew abandoned the ship in 3 lifeboats and 4 rafts. Meanwhile, tensions were rising inside the U-boat. Tim knew that Allied naval forces must have been on the way, but he was committed to his nation and honored Admiral Dernitz's recommendation that it was better to sink one enemy ship than damage several friendly ones. Tim consequently stayed and fired 2 more torpedoes, fleeing into the Pacific only after damaging Walker beyond repair. At 5 p.m. on Christmas Day, the freighter finally capsized in the Tasman Sea, and by the time the first rescue vessels arrived, they found the abandoned ship with the stern awash to the bridge. Meanwhile, the stowaways were not rescued until 24 hours after the event. 67 men were located in the early morning, with 2 crew members having lost their lives. The survivors were picked up by HMAS Quickmatch and taken to Sydney 3 days later. Despite a massive Royal Australian Air Force and Navy search and destroy mission, Tim and his crew avoided the Allied hunt and sailed eastward toward New Zealand. Then, in early 1945, the U-boat sank a second Liberty ship, USS Peter Sylvester, achieving a total of 7 credited victories. When Germany surrendered months later, the submarine was gifted to the Japanese government, and she continued her career as I-506. After the Robert J. Walker incident, a damaged wooden nameboard came ashore on Bearware Beach, near Sussex Inlet. With its edges chamfered with some of the original cream-colored paint, some of the recessed lettering was still visible, reading Robert J. W.A. The incident proved a rare chapter in wartime history, as it was the only case in which a German U-boat sank an Allied ship in the Pacific during World War II. As the $3 billion USS Connecticut submarine was making her way through unknown waters in October of 2021, the crew wasn't aware that the sonar was malfunctioning, and they were very relaxed. By the time an unidentified object was picked up by the sophisticated sensors of the US Navy submarine, it was already too late to react. The colossal submarine hit the sea floor, and its entire hull shook with violence. Then a brutal and empty cracking noise was heard. The submarine had just lost its nose, and it was quickly sinking. The Seawolf class comprises nuclear-powered, fast attack submarines that were designed to replace the aging Los Angeles-class submarines. Their design and development began in the early 1980s, before the end of the Cold War. The Seawolf design responded to Soviet ballistic missiles and attack submarines of the Typhoon and Akula classes, and is quieter, faster, and more significant than the Los Angeles-class submarine. The Seawolf class subs have a length of 353 feet, a beam of 40 feet, and a surface displacement of 8,600 tons. Fully submerged, they can display between 9,000 and 12,000 pounds, depending on the load. The model also multiplies the number of torpedo tubes and weaponry she can carry, and is armed with 8 26.5-inch torpedo tubes for 21-inch weapons. In addition, up to 50 weapons can be stored in the torpedo room. Harpoon anti-ship missiles, Tomahawk land attack missiles, or Mk-48 guided torpedoes are some of them. General Dynamics Electric Boat was initially tasked with developing a fleet of over 30 submarines in 10 years. Still, budget constraints quickly reduced it to just 12. Each submarine was valued at over $3 billion during the 1980s. Today's equivalent would be about $5 billion. When the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union was finally dissolved, the Seawolf submarines were limited even further to just 3 boats: USS Seawolf, USS Jimmy Carter, and USS Connecticut. USS Jimmy Carter became the most expensive U.S. Navy vessel until then, coming at about $3.5 billion. And with good reason. The submarine was 100 feet longer than her sisters due to the insertion of a multi-mission platform, a section used for launching remotely operated underwater vehicles and Navy SEALs. USS Connecticut was the second Seawolf-class submarine. She was ordered in May of 1991 and laid down in September of 1992. Moreover, she's one of 5 U.S. Navy vessels to bear the name of the American state. The Seawolf-class submarine was launched on September 1, 1997, by the governor of Connecticut, John G. Rowland, and his wife. She was then commissioned in early December of 1998 under the motto Arsenal of the Nation. USS Connecticut displaces over 9,130 pounds when fully loaded, and is 353 feet long, has a 40-foot beam, and a 36-foot draft. She's powered by an S6W PWR nuclear reactor that generates over 45,000 horsepower to 1 shaft, 1 pump jet propulsor, and 1 propulsion submerged motor. The nuclear-powered submarine has unlimited range and can make her way through the ocean at 35 knots while submerged. Her armament comprised 8 26-inch torpedo tubes with a capacity for holding 40 torpedoes, missiles, or 100 naval mines to engage underwater and on-water threats. All in all, USS Connecticut has a conventional submarine design with a rounded nose section, a rounded hull form, and a cruciform rudder arrangement, and her peculiar sail is fitted forward of midships with its unique sloped area. The submarine had her shakedown cruise and standard patrols before the 9/11 attacks in 2001, but when the War on Terror began, she and her crew of 101 men and 15 officers were called to help. Connecticut then became part of the WASP Expeditionary Strike Group and eventually returned to the Naval Submarine Base New London for maintenance. In April of 2003, the submarine had a unique encounter with a polar bear when she surfaced in the Arctic at the University of Washington's Applied Physics Laboratory ice station. Footage and pictures from the encounter show the mammal engaging the submarine's rudder with curious gnaws. 4 years later, Connecticut was transferred to Naval Base Kitsap Bremerton, Washington, where she was stationed with her 2 sister submarines as part of Submarine Development Squadron 5. The transfer followed a Navy strategy to bolster the American submarine force in the Pacific. USS Connecticut would then participate in the massive 2011 ICEX naval exercises focused on Arctic environment training. She eventually underwent several modifications that lasted 6 years, and then surfaced to participate in ICEX 2018. The vessel was deployed to the Pacific for standard patrols following the exercise. Later that year, the $3 billion submarine underwent maintenance and significant upgrades that cost over $17 million. In the fall of 2021, USS Connecticut was deployed to the Pacific for standard patrols. A few weeks into the mission, disaster struck as the submarine collided with a seamount while making her way through the South China Sea. Many sailors were injured, and the collision caused extensive damage. Following the crash, the Seawolf-class submarine made way for Guam for damage assessment from the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Teams from the Intermediate Maintenance Facility and the crew of the submarine tender USS Emory S. Land also inspected the damage sustained by USS Connecticut. After her stop in Guam, the nuclear attack submarine arrived in San Diego after a long month of surface transit. Following a brief stay at the Californian city, the Navy explained that the submarine was bound for Bremerton, Washington, to undergo extensive repairs following the strange collision. However, pictures of the incident's aftermath told a larger story. USNI News reported that, according to the official U.S. Navy version, only the sonar dome had suffered extensive damage, making travel underwater unsafe. The news network mentioned that, quote, the tip of the submarine's bow had been removed. Still, the pictures show that more than just the tip was removed. As the Navy launched an official investigation to determine the cause of the accident, the U.S. Pacific Fleet issued a statement that read, quote, the Seawolf-class fast attack submarine USS Connecticut struck an object while submerged on the afternoon of October 2nd. The submarine remains in a safe and stable condition. USS Connecticut's nuclear propulsion plant and spaces were not affected and remain fully operational. The extent of damage to the remainder of the submarine is being assessed. The U.S. Navy has not requested assistance. The incident will be investigated. Meanwhile, USS Connecticut's commander, executive officer, and boat chief were relieved from command. In a press statement, Vice Admiral William Houston said, quote, we have very rigorous navigation safety procedures, and they fell short of what our standard was. In May of 2022, a redacted report about the accident was released. The report stated that the submarine was conducting a humanitarian evacuation in international waters at the time of the accident. However, other sources claimed that it was carrying out a classified operation in the South China Sea. Whichever the case, the Navy noted that there were command climate issues before the collision incident and a tense relationship between the commander's staff and the crew. The report mentioned that Commander Cameron Agilani was not up to the demands of his post since he assumed command of the submarine in 2019 and had failed to live up to expectations, leading to the incident that could have proven catastrophic. The optimal path between Connecticut's initial location and the Pacific included areas with available and unavailable underwater survey data. Still, Commander Agilani believed she would be fully functional by using the submarine's Voyage Management System, or VMS. He then opted for a temporary route plan and skipped safety checks, one of which was consulting the VMS. Additionally, the redactions made it clear that the submarine began to experience some technical difficulties with her AN/BQQ-10 bottom sounder sonar systems. One of the footnotes said, quote, the ship reported that although the aft bottom sounder was fully operational, its operation degraded at speeds above 16 knots. The Navy indicates that at a speed of 24 knots, the bottom sounder transducers should operate normally up to 8,400 feet beneath the keel before experiencing degradation. For unknown reasons, the submarine's cruising speed was increased from 16 to 24 knots during the trip. The report noted that there were discrepancies between the information from the navigation charts and the sounding data collected. Apparently, the watch team debated using the boat's fathometer to gather a more accurate reading. Still, they refrained from using it to avoid detection. The unredacted entry stated that the last underwater grounding said, quote, the sonar supervisor identified a trace near the bow. The trace was classified as biologics, a sea creature or other underwater fauna. The sonar supervisor stated that there were no other contacts. Before the collision, the crew failed to change the submarine's depth and slowed the speed of the ascent. Once the damage was done, The crew struggled to keep the ship moving forward, but managed to keep her steady and prevent her from sinking back down. The reports concluded that, quote, "No single action or inaction caused this mishap, but it was preventable. It resulted from an accumulation of errors and omissions in navigation planning, watch team execution, and risk management. Prudent decision-making and adherence to standards in any one of these three areas could have prevented the grounding." The U.S. Congress later authorized $50 million in repair funds, of which $10 million were for a spare Seawolf-class bow dome and $40 million for USS Connecticut emergent repairs. Ultimately, the Navy is fully committed to returning her to its fleet.